Greetings and welcome to another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. The theme for this month is going to be the idea of raising the rigor in your classroom, specifically using higher level questioning skills in order to do so. The first place we need to start, though, is defining what rigor actually is, and almost as equally as important as what rigor is not, because there are a lot of misconceptions about what rigor is. For example, what you see here is 7 myths about rigor and learning. The first one being that lots of homework is a sign of rigor. Some people think that more work makes it rigorous. It's not giving more work, it's getting different work that actually creates the rigor. And that kind of ties into the second one. Rigor means doing more. I think a lot of times the definition that some teachers have of rigor is doing more with less time. That's not rigor, that's just poor time management. Another myth is that rigor is not for everyone. So even though I usually are talking about skills that really work well with gifted students, rigor can be used with any student because it is the way you're asking them to think about something. And everyone can think about something at a higher level if they're given the opportunity to do so. Providing support means lessening the rigor. Which is, again, not the case. So scaffolding up to the rigor means that you are still getting to that point. You're just providing the steps for them to use to get there if they're struggling to get there. But they still need to get to the rigor as their stopping point, their finish line, so to speak. Resources equal rigor. So, and what is kind of meant by that is like giving a student a harder book is rigor. That certainly can be challenging for a student, but it doesn't necessarily increase the rigor, especially if it's covering the exact same themes as a book that is less challenging. The thinking of the themes is still going to remain the same. So you need to, if you're going to increase the rigor, then you need to have resources that are requiring kids to think at different levels than the normal resources would. The sixth myth is that standards take care of rigor. I will say this, that standards do a good job, and we'll talk about this in a future Todd Talk, of writing the verb so that you know what level of rigor you should be at. And it's not, I'm going to kind of push back on this one a little bit, that standards do kind of show you where the rigor should be. The problem is that not all teachers are teaching to the level of that rigor. They teach the standard, but they're not teaching to the level of thinking that the standard is asking them to do. The last one is that rigor is just one more thing to do. And, a lot of teachers take that attitude of, I don't have any time, I can't do this. This is not about adding more. This is just like you don't add more to a student's to make it. This is about changing the way you think about, how you're going to set up an assignment, how you're going to make it rigorous. So those are some examples of what rigor is not, or what myths of rigor are. We've established what rigor is not. So now the logical question becomes, what is rigor? This graphic right here does a good job of kind of encapsulating what rigor is. So in the rigor is not aspect, you can see it has things we just talked about, which is more is not rigorous. More work, more homework, more hard, so on and so forth. Rigor is getting kids, you can see there's a pattern with all of these. Rigor is, it's in the thinking that students do. So it's scaffolding the thinking, so to get them to that point by asking them lower level questions and leading up to higher level questions. It's planning this out. It's assessing, asking questions at the level that the content standard is asking you to assess them at. It's recognizing, the level of thinking that students have demonstrated. So again, students may give a very complex presentation, but the level of thinking is still very lower level, and so that would not be rigorous. Managing the teaching and learning level for, how do you, as a teacher, do you get your classroom to be a place where it's a rigorous classroom where thinking is going on quite a bit? This is what this might look like in the questions that you ask in the classroom. So for instance, what is the circumference of the Earth? Would this be a hard question or a rigorous question? This would be a hard question. And the reason why is it's not something that's necessarily common knowledge, but it's also not something that can really be debated or argued. The circumference of the Earth is the circumference of the Earth. You would read that somewhere. You may make arguments for different points, like from the equator has a different circumference than if you're up in the northern latitude or the southern latitude. And so you could certainly make an argument for that, but it's going to be the measurements are going to be the same. You can't really argue that. There's no real higher level of thinking going on here. The question of when should you use the Pythagorean theory, quite a complex theory in math, but this is a hard question. You're just applying things, because what you have to do is you have to take what you know about that and apply it to a situation and where something is either right or it's wrong. Math can be really challenging to be rigorous because thinking a lot of times means having open-ended responses or multiple responses, and in math it's usually one, but there is a way to challenge mathematical thinking to think at a rigorous level. This question is, what is the best form of government? This seems like an opinion question, and that's exactly why it makes it rigorous, because it is an opinion. There's not one right answer. Students could make a lot of arguments. They could argue for communism, they could argue for socialism, they can make an argument for democracy, monarchy. There's arguments that can be made for any of those. And so because of that, students could choose what government they want to back. The key part is having a criteria for what they're basing this on. So how are they determining what is a good government or not? Another question would be, why is the sky blue? This actually could be hard or rigorous, depending upon how you ask the question. So if you're in a science class and you ask students, why is the sky blue? There's a definitive answer. So, there's a reason the sky is blue, and it can be scientifically explained. However, if you ask an elementary class why the sky is blue, they may come up with all sorts of creative answers. Examples being like, it's because the grass is green and the sun is yellow, it makes the blue of the sky, or that just lots of different possibilities, lots of creativity involved, lots of different higher levels of thinking that are taking place here. So depending on who you ask that question to and how you expect the responses to come back as would be hard or rigorous. And then lastly is, what is the theme of the book Frankenstein? Now, some would think this might be a rigorous because it's not explicitly stated in the book. This is the theme. You have to kind of read between the lines, so to speak. But it's still just inference. This just makes it hard because there's going to be concrete clues in the book that tell you what the theme is. And you could certainly make arguments for different types of things, but more than likely the theme is pretty established. You can make arguments for lesser themes, but the major theme of certain books is set in stone, and it's the way it is, and that's what makes it a hard question, but not a rigorous question. So once you've established what hard and rigorous, the difference between those two, you need to be more aware of asking rigorous questions and how do you get students to think at different levels. A good way to do this is by using what you see here, which is Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy are the different levels of thinking that students are going to be doing, starting at the bottom with remembering and going to the top with creating. You notice that as you ask different levels of questions, you increase the rigor in your classroom because you're asking kids to think differently. And you can see this is even scaffolded. So you start that you have a base of remembering, and then it leads up to understanding, which leads to applying, and so on and so forth. So I like to use Bloom's taxonomy to increase the rigor in my classroom because it gives you a clear blueprint of how to get students there. But it does require you being aware of the types of questions that you're asking. And just to prove this further, if you look at the rigor relevance chart, or framework, what you see here is, again, even though it's using the old Bloom's, it's still the same idea, but the higher you get in the thinking, from 1 to 6, from the knowledge and awareness to the evaluation, the more rigorous you're making things. And you can combine that by making things more relevant. So if students can actually apply to real world unpredictable situation, so that's the best case scenario, is that students are thinking at the highest level and applying it to real world situations. And so that takes it even a step further with the rigor. We've talked a lot about theory in today's Todd Talk, but the question becomes then, how do you make this a teaching practice? And the simple way is that you ask higher level questions in your classroom and you become more aware of that. So what does that look like? That's what we'll talk about in future Todd Talks for this month, is how to write higher level questions and how to become aware of the types of questions that you're asking in your classroom.